Hello there, yes, it's the weekend. Better get some gardening done, said me in a thrilled voice. Yes, anyway, yes, the weekend. New culture forum, new video, where we learn a lot about Jesus, apparently. Also, what a great place Singapore is. Let's dive in, shall we?
Yeah.
I do think that we need some sort of bulwark against some of the rewiring that has been going on in society. So the thing that Christianity in particular, since we're talking about this context, brings is a set of, well, it's a metaphysic, but it's also a set of rules that dictate, relationships, that dictate the ideal, their social kind of relationships that are under assault right now, especially in the US. You see that with gender ideology. You see that with even like critical race theory that is extremely racially divisive and quite in opposition to, the kind of ultimately the kind of pluralism and equality that say like a figure like Jesus Christ preached.
Well, yeah, maybe. I'm not absolutely convinced, however, that a modern-day return of Jesus would see him sitting comfortably with elements of the American Republican movement. Can't really quite see it, so, as ever, the wanting to grab a bit of Jesus for ourselves bit does fall a bit flat, doesn't it? I mean, if nothing else, you have to assume that Jesus believed in equality. And he would be a bit hacked off with people that sought otherwise. Surely. Anyway, let's move on.
And one of the things that I think I've spoken to you about this before is that I see woke, quote unquote, wokeness as an ideology that rewires hierarchies. So it asks, students to turn on their teachers. It asks young children to subvert their parents, right? So even the traditional relationships that have hierarchy gradients, those gradients are being are dissolved and being replaced by new ones. And so you're now seeing in schools in America where teachers are being told, if a child starts to question their gender identity, you hide it from the parents. This is,
Yes.
and we're sitting here like it's fine. Why are we not on the streets?
And legislative efforts of the sort led by people like Ron DeSantis in Florida saying, that shouldn't be allowed. Here's an 8-page bill saying you can't bloody do that in public schools.
Exactly.
He's the extremist,
Exactly.
which is the extraordinary thing.
Yes, good old Ron DeSantis, who only yesterday actually was interviewed in the States, saying about how much he would have loved to have been one of Jesus' disciples. Again, it's that thing about owning Christianity and owning Jesus as a model member of the Republican Party. I personally don't think that Ron DeSantis would make the shortlist to be a disciple, no matter what time frame we're dealing with. But the key thing about this is you'll notice is that quote-unquote wokeness is quote-unquote not defined, other than being generally a bad thing. If you're a very, very at-heart traditionalist American Christian, you would see the notion of children being given the ability to action themselves as being very, very threatening, because when you come from that particularly patriarchal view of it, it really is, yes? Children questioning the man of the household is the kind of worst communist nightmare that you could possibly come up with. Anyway, let's move on a bit.
Very quickly before we finish, because I think our British viewers will be interested to hear this. I've heard you talk very eloquently before about, so in many ways we don't want to become like Singapore. I wouldn't. I like the Anglo-American tradition of limited government, but I think it needs a strong moral fibre in order for it to be possible. Yeah. And if it doesn't, then you probably do need to be a little bit more. But one thing that Singapore is very good at is managing its diversity, as I understand, in a way that we're struggling to do in Britain, because diversity turns out it isn't as much of a strength as the Mayor of London makes out it is. It's a challenge and it needs to be managed, but Singapore's very good at making sure that The fact that it is a very diverse population doesn't create ghettoization. I mean, how does it do that, and how do you think that European countries, which are increasingly, due to their own foolishness, having to contend with this issue, how do you think that can be? What can we learn from Singapore on that front?
Well, I think a lot of Westerners are uncomfortable with the Singapore model because of how paternalistic the state is. It's really...
Yes, indeed. So, what can we learn from Singapore? Well, luckily Singapore is one of those places that people know very little about. And the way it's presented here is that it's a paternalistic state, which is nicely, paternal, isn't it? Yes, where the strong man rules. And if you look at Singapore, it is extremely debatable whether or not it's actually a democracy. And Posh Boy is right here. He would have a lot of problems living there. Except, of course, he wouldn't. And this is where we get to the heart of this basic kind of libertarian view of the world. Because if Posh Boy went to Singapore, he wouldn't be affected by the Singaporean government. Yeah, none of this lot are. Because they have the economic agency, that word again, if you like. Not like children, obviously. Children can't have agency, but adults can have agency. Anyway, they have the agency to not have to live under the very, very repressive rules, which basically they think that everyone else should. And again, this is the problem at the heart of this kind of libertarianism. It wants freedom of thought and freedom of action, but not for you, just for them. And they're quite happy to pass laws to make sure that it isn't for you. After all, you wouldn't know what to do with it, would you? Anyway, have a lovely weekend.